Well, welcome to this very special forum, very special occasion, and I deem it a great privilege to be asked to interview our distinguished guest, Dr. Geoffrey Dobbs on my left, and his wife Elizabeth further over. I propose to try and ask a number of questions which I hope will cover a very wide area, but I think we might start by just observing that the League of Rights as a movement grew out, of course, of the old social credit movement, which had its roots deep back before the First and Second World War, and even the roots of that social credit idea goes much deeper than that. And the man, of course, who provided what we call social credit, a revelation to the late C.H. Douglas, and Dr. Geoffrey Dobbs here, and his wife Elizabeth had the good fortune, I would say, to have known them personally, known Douglas and his wife, and to have worked with them. So we are very privileged tonight to go back into history and go back to the roots of the movement that those of you in this audience tonight are particularly concerned about. Now, I thought, Dr. Dobbs, we might start by something a little personal, your own background. When people first of all hear doctor, they wonder whether you're a medical doctor or so many doctors today, or perhaps you're a doctor of economics. I hope not.
Well, no, they've called me a lot of things, actually. For instance, in a very broad sense, a botanist, but my special line was on soil microbes, fungi particularly. And at Bangor, the University College Bangor, where I've been since 1947, except I retired a good time ago, I was called the forest botanist. So I was dealing with foresters, mainly forest ecology and forest soils. Those were my main teaching and research interests.
And the doctorate, though, that's in what field?
Well, in botany in the broad sense, and in fungi in the specialist sense.
All right, well, how did you first become interested in social credit, hear about it?
Well, curiously enough, I sort of spiraled in from the Boy Scout movement. I was running a scout troop, and there was a chap walking about in a green uniform who knew all about bows and arrows. So I got him along to talk to my boys, and after the meeting, he started talking what sounded to me a lot of nonsense. Has that gone dead now?
Don't worry about that.
And we walked around the block about 6 times, and I still thought it was a lot of nonsense, but it got under my skin. And gradually, as I say, spiraled in until I heard about this man called Major Douglas. And there I found the headquarters of the social credit movement, as it was in those days, right in the middle of London, quite near my college. A well-organised concern with a number of young ladies serving lunch. Very good lunch it was. There's one of them over there. And of course, once I was in touch with the foundation of the thing, one became a social creditor. But I'd still say it took 10 years before I was a mature enough social creditor to initiate things on my own. It takes time.
You mentioned how you met your wife Elizabeth. She was herself closely associated with the movement. Your late father.
Yes, I'm one of the earliest second-generation social creditors. So
Yes,
I caught it from
I
my
recall his name, Hewlett Edwards. He used to.
Yes, he was Hewlett Edwards, and he used to correspond with people in these parts. And he was overseas director of the Social Credit Secretariat.
Now, I know this is a very difficult question, and you can't expect sort of answer that some interviewers expect, but what would you say is the central aspect of social credit? What do you feel that Douglas brought to the world that was quite unique, quite distinctive, quite original?
That is a difficult one, because he brought, I think what he brought was realism. That is to say, political and economic argument and discussion was all carried on in words, and mainly by people with art and linguistic background. And into this general talk and discussion came a man with a practical background, an engineer. He happened also to have a tremendous broad mental capacity and a deep philosophy, fundamentally Christian philosophy. And I think if one can sum up his great contribution, it was that he brought all this waffle, this talk, down to practical reality. Of course, he soon identified, put his finger on the cause of the major trouble, which all the wafflers of left and right and so on had ignored, namely, of course, the monetary system. And after a while, he found that it wasn't merely a question of correcting the system, it was the people who ran the system. As a simple engineer, he thought, well, I've discovered a serious defect in the system. But he soon discovered that the defect suited the people who were running it very well. And that normally, as most practical people would say, if you find an error in something, naturally people would put it right. He soon came across people like, for instance, Sidney Webb.
The top Fabian.
Yes, who said, well, Mr. Douglas, there's a good deal of argument about your system, but we don't like its purpose. And that was honest speaking. His purpose was decentralization of power to the individual, economic and political power. And their purpose was centralization. And they had the honesty at least to say, we don't like its purpose, and that's really the reason why, for instance, economists don't like social creditors, because one is top down and the other's bottom up, as you might say.
Would you say then it's primarily a philosophical question?
Well, no, I think it's a practical question, yes. It's philosophical also. I don't think you can distinguish them. Because one of the things he did was to make it clear to us that every philosophy, let's say, idea about the nature of things people have, expresses itself in a policy that is a a series of practical objectives. And such a philosophy tied down to a policy is rightly called a religion, where it means to bind back. So I think that is really the great contribution that Douglas made.
Well, then you would say that large numbers of people would never accept the financial side of social credit because they object to the purpose of those financial proposals. That is to put the individual in the position where he's free.
I think large numbers of people, fairly large numbers, but a very small minority, who seek power above all, would disagree with us fundamentally. But most people simply want to live their own lives and to have the power to do so, both economic and, if necessary, political. But if we had the economic power, the politics would become, I think, a minor matter. There are not many political matters that are not concerned in some way with economics and with money.
What about a few words on Douglas the man?
And I think all I can say is that he was big. I don't mean physically. He was just large-minded. He had a comprehensive sort of mind, and at the same time he was able to view the world disinterestedly. That's a word sometimes misused to mean uninterested. That was very far from it. I mean impartially, as it was. I've never met anyone with his capacity for that. In fact, I think Elizabeth and I were, and of course many other people, and alas most of them died off by now, were privileged to know a genius. And that's a word I don't use lightly.
You would say then that most of the prophecies, if you use that word, that he made, if we pursued present policies, are virtually come about. We've gone from one disaster to the next. We've seen your own country reduced to a situation where its very independence is threatened.
On economic grounds, way back in 1918, he wrote that price, no, I didn't call it price inflation, continuous rise in prices was inevitable. It was mathematically built in. And all the economists jeered and said, oh, nonsense, and you're just mistaking temporary variations. You have inflation and deflation and so on. They managed a tiny bit of deflation during the Great Depression, but look at it now. I mean, inflation is totally built in, and it's mathematically built in. It's absurd monkeying about with interest rates and such things. They can sometimes shock people a little bit into postponing their debts a bit. But the inflation that is now completely worldwide is a simply built-in feature of the credit system there, which from our point of view is the debt system. It didn't happen all through the ages because in those days money was a real commodity, bits of metal of intrinsic value. And people get hopelessly confused about this because we still use bits of metal as coins, but they're merely little tokens. Money is bank credit. That's the top-down view. From our point of view, money is debt, repayable with interest. And he went further to show that the complication and time span of the industrial process automatically builds in a time lag between the prices that must be generated in the process of production. All the costs must be added up at. You must get the price back at least, plus some profit, if you remain in business. And the incomes distributed in the processes of production, which are spun out over a long time, and inevitably there's a huge time lag between them. And this, again, is blatantly obvious now. It was all denied then. But that results in a continual shortage of purchasing power. Economists will raise their hands and say, oh, there are floods of money, there's far too much, and all that, chasing too much money, chasing too few goods. And they simply ignore the minus sign which is attached to the money. A very large part of it is borrowed, is debt. When Douglas said these things in the early 20s, there wasn't such a thing as consumer credit, hire purchase, the never never, all that. Now the economy depends upon it. His point is entirely proved. Not that you'll get economists to agree with you. They'll dodge it by descending into some sort of jargon and say, oh yes, you wouldn't understand if you hadn't economic agreement. So there's this contrast between people who look first at the world as it is, the real world, a production and consumption of goods and energy and so on, and then look at the money world. They've got it upside down. They look at the money first, and money controls everything.
Mm. Well, moving along now to the current situation in Britain, how do you see it now with the common market and what's happening in Europe? And particularly, I would say that many Australians are most interested in this remarkable woman, Margaret Thatcher. What's her position in the scheme of things?
Well, on the one hand, we find she's almost alone in the world among top politicians who are standing up as far as they can in the isolation she's in, except for the common people backing her, against, for instance, the continual centralization of Europe, against, in particular, Britain joining the European Monetary Fund. We just can't expect one woman all alone to stand up indefinitely, but she has gained time. And when it seemed inevitable and she just got to give way, look what has happened in Eastern Europe. The whole situation suddenly got fluid. We don't know what will happen, but whether the consolidation of the present EC can proceed as planned, with all Europe going fluid and Germany threatening unification, and the East Germans, Hungarians and Czechs are pouring over the frontier to get some of the goodies on the western side and so on. We don't know, but there it is. She gained some time. And we don't know what will happen now, but the situation is not as predictable as it was. On the other hand, we are afraid that on the home front, she may lose her power base, because the things that the people surrounding her in her own party persuaded her to do they look all right on the surface, but just to mention one of them, which you experience here, the word privatization sounds lovely, doesn't it? But as if the private individual is going to own the former public services. But we can all, Australians and British, see through that. Services are going into the hands of multinationals instead of national organizations. And that is losing her credit at home. And she may lose the next election if she goes on along those lines at home. And then of course, she can exert no influence in foreign policy.
There's not an immediate election threatening, though, is there?
No, it's 2 years, isn't it?
Yes, I think it's 2 years.
Mm.
So you would say she might give valuable time.
Well, we hope so in the home front. On the foreign front, we don't know what will happen, except that the time she's gained could be valuable.
So you wouldn't be bold enough to join the prophets and make any firm predictions?
No. No, I'm glad to say you can't prophesy. Well, now things are boiled up.
Yeah.
Anything might happen.
Dr. Dobbs, looking over your long career, and might say so, quite distinguished career, you've dealt with a number of matters, a number of subjects, I notice. One that we still have here was in Australia, fluoridation. Now, you were very much involved in that, both as a scientist and as I suppose, a social creditor.
Well, yes. Much against my will, I was dragged into this by the local medical officer in North Wales, in Anglesey, where one of the government experiments was carried out. And I was busy enough, I didn't want to be involved, but the nonsense this man wrote in the press was so awful. I butted in. Now, in doing this, I was fulfilling a function which social creditors are called upon to do once they've sort of been through the training and have attained a certain maturity in the subject. It's called the civil service. I was acting as a civil servant of policy. The ordinary people didn't want fluoride in the water anywhere in the world that I've discovered. But the technique of putting it over them is to come over with a lot of phony science and make out it's a technical matter. Now, my function was not to know all about fluorides and fluoridation, but just to debunk this blinding with science technique and to suggest to people as much as I could, stick to the guns. Your real line is that you don't want to drink this stuff and you're being forced to drink it if it's put in the water. Stick to that line and you'll win. If you get arguing with a medical officer or a dentist about teeth, or a medical officer about health, and what fluoride does to you and all that sort of thing, even though you're right and he's wrong, he's got the jargon, and they'll believe him, and you'll probably lose the case. So, but on the other hand, if one has enough science to be able to use the jargon, then you can fight the technical ground, not by saying, look, my side's wrong, it does this to you, not that, and so on. Simply show that their statistics were just, childish. I mean, it was just nonsense and that sort of thing. Well, Dr. Sutton and others here have carried out the same function. They've debunked the phony science, which, if you've enough scientific training, you can do, and leave it. But for, say, they drag in some prestigious institution like the Royal College of Physicians, and they get Mrs. Jones, the grocer's wife, or someone arguing with them, and she won't win on that, about techniques, about teeth, or about whether it causes this, that, and the other disease, and so on. And that was not the point. The point is that that Mrs. Jones didn't want it, and it was being imposed upon her, because she must drink water against her will, which is intolerable in a democratic society of any sort. And wherever the people have really stuck to that line, they win. And our function, people who happen to have a bit of knowledge in the field, is simply to hold off all this technical stuff.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Dobbs, moving on from there, you'll have noticed, of course, in Australia during this visit of yours, the conservation question, so-called, has become a major one. You had a long association with the conservation movement and the whole subject of ecology from the point of view of your own training. And what would you have to say about what's happening now to the conservation movement?
Yes, I was teaching ecology for a long time before it became anything to do with politics. It was just a branch of science, a study of the environment and relation between organisms. Basically, when the movement that is now called the Green Movement, they called themselves in Britain the Ecology Movement originally. We didn't like that, the people who were professional ecologists, but all the same, I was, and I am, all on their side. It is the movement that is now attracting youth, and on very solid grounds. Therefore, it is the movement that is certain to be taken over. The modern green movement is now called, or is, I suppose, started by that famous book, Silent Spring, by Rachel Carson. I remember when that came out, it really rocked America from the president down. He set up a committee and so on. I happened to be over there the following year, and the big chemical firms had got around to debunking it as unscientific and political and all that sort of thing. It wasn't. Yes, it was a work of advocacy, but it was soundly argued, soundly based. And a number of, in my view, reputable people. One of them is James Lovelock, and another is E.F. Schumacher, Small is Beautiful, that book, have exerted a very beneficial influence. But it's bad enough at home, the way that big business and big money has moved in, exploited everything and twisted a lot of these young people, but not all of them, around. For instance, in Germany, they've been quite successful as a political party. Once you form a political party, your objectives change from, for instance, protecting the environment to power for us and our crowd. We must, this has always been the argument. It was the social credit movement. The only way we can, these are splendid ideas we have, we must get power and impose them on other people. And various branches that started off in the social credit movement drifted off into party politics. The trouble was that they had some success too, in Alberta, for instance. And this distracted all sorts of people. People go in for power politics. They hope to be an MP or something with, some of the pickings and the prestige and all that. And that has taken the place of the original objective. Now, the core, the honest core of the Green movement, I think there is still an honest core. In Britain, the way it's been taken over, it really rather amuses me, because when I was teaching ecology in the 50s, all the sort of official establishment in agricultural science and forestry and so on really thought I was a crank talking about planting the right sort of trees and bothering about the soil and mycorrhiza, the fungus roots that infect every tree and enable it to grow in poor soils and all that sort of thing. They called it muck and magic. And now muck and magic's taken over in big business. And all these scientists that used to accuse us of muck and magic are now blasting out muck and magic like anything. But so I do feel, first of all, that here is a movement which on sound, legitimate grounds is attracting the young, and the one thing they desperately need is social credit. They haven't grasped that 90% of the things they deplore, of the appalling destruction of the environment, is carried out not for real purposes, but for monetary reasons. Now, I come over here and I've talked like this and say, look, there's a sound movement. It's being distorted. But I must say that it's much, the distortion is much cruder here than it is at home. It's much more blatant. For instance, at home, the Friends of the Earth are a very respectable organization. When they oppose something, they at least assemble the facts, and people refer to them. The government and local councils and so on refer to them for the facts. If they criticize some statement put out, say, by a nuclear power station, they have nuclear physicists and people to whom they refer. They don't just blow away. So generally speaking, they're all the same, of course. The way all big business is now pretending to go green, and all the major destructive projects have been carried out by huge concerns and centrally financed. Now they all pretend to be, they take one little item which they've removed from some product and claim that they're very green because of that and so on. So I do see that your difficulty here is much, you're up against something much cruder. But I still say the core of the thing is sound. Of course, all the scare stuff is another matter.
You think most of the material on the greenhouse and that is in that field?
Well, remembering all the experience I had in fluoridation and the way that phony science was seized upon, both sides, and I think it improbable that even the greenhouse effect is an immediate threat that is made out to be. The fact is that no doubt the argument starts off sound, that you're squandering our fossil fuels that have been there for geological ages in what is, in geological terms, a sudden flash. I mean, a few centuries, that's no time. And we must expect some changes. On the other hand, such changes have always been occurring to the Earth. Sometimes what in human terms seem to be very slowly, taking millions of years. And I dare say there may have been some catastrophes, like collision with an asteroid or something in the past. But the situation is incredibly complex. All right, we are suddenly pouring out CO2 and other gases into the air. Now, I place a good deal of credence on Dr. James Lovelock, a remarkable and independent-minded scientist who is rather a key figure in what I regard as the genuine green movement. And his Gaia hypothesis is to the effect that the Earth has the properties of a living organism. I won't agree that it's an organism, but it is, the surface of the Earth is covered with life known as the biosphere, and it has the properties of life. Among them is a property called homeostasis, which we all have in our bodies, every living organism. That is, or to use current jargon, negative feedback. Let's say we couldn't walk unless we had this property. We lurch to the right, an automatic reaction occurs, tending us to lurch, negative feedback, we tend to lurch a bit to the left. Nobody walks dead straight. And the same with riding a bicycle and so on. And all the operations of our body are subject to this. And so you pour out a lot of CO2 and certain other gases, and you will get some automatic reaction from the biosphere, and the complication of the situation is terrific. For instance, you'll get, you begin to get a warming of the atmosphere, and then you get a growth of plankton in the sea, which will have an opposite effect, or some of them will. You warm the equator. There's all this scare about flooding when the polar ice melts. Well, in fact, the floating ice will not raise the sea level at all. Floating ice, when it melts, doesn't. Ice off the land will. Actually, if it becomes water and then reaches 4 degrees Celsius, it'll be denser and occupy a little less room. On the other hand, the equatorial water will expand, and then there are complications galore about the, for instance, there's these El Nino current in the Pacific, which in some way increases droughts in Africa and India. But quite apart from that, slight variations in the sun's heat, which regularly occur, are probably far more important than anything we can do on Earth. Slight variations in the Earth's orbit have effect. Well, you've got to calculate all these things. It's not just simple result. And you can measure this, that, and the other, and then you put something into the computer which extrapolates, let's say, evens it out over the whole business, which is a guess. So, yes, all this pollution and skilless waste of our resources is bad for the biosphere, for the living organisms, including us. But that it will produce an immediate catastrophe is on the Earth scale, if itself, it's extremely unlikely, it seems to me. On the other hand, we've had doom, doom, doom on us. Contradictory dooms. One remembers the threat to a falling population, and that there are a lot of old people, and every fifth house empty, wasn't it, Elizabeth? And something, and then all of a sudden the population was going to exploded, went off with a bang, and of course we remember the whole generation brought up in the terror of the nuclear bomb. It was sure to happen. It was scarcely worth living. I mean, bound to be blown up or have a radioactive Earth. So it was going to be at the same time practically an empty radioactive Earth with the population exploding continually as well. Anything sensational will be exaggerated as long as it keeps people in fear. So I say, do not let the exaggeration of things like the greenhouse effect, which incidentally have been a godsend to the nuclear industry, the greenhouse effect. They've been exploiting it ruthlessly. You turn to nukes, they don't increase the greenhouse effect, and so on.
As I've said long career, you've touched on so many aspects of human affairs that we can't deal with them all one night, but you have, of course, written and lectured quite extensively in the field of what we'll call religion. I read with some interest many of your articles in religious journals. You participate in conferences, and so as a scientist you've seen no conflict between religion, as you see, or Christianity in particular, and science.
No, I agree. I've always maintained, and I find there's a great deal of more learned support from theologians and historians, that modern science, the science that ties things back to reality, to the physical facts and so on, arose out of Christianity. It didn't arise out of any of the other religions, I mean Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam. Well, Islam contributed our symbols, the Arabic numeral, for instance, and made a contribution to mathematics. For mathematics, my old father, who was a mathematician, used to say it was the handmaid of the sciences, but it's the handmaid that's taken them over since then. And the realistic science in which you bend your mind to fit the facts arose from Christianity. And it's departed from it now, is departing very much. And that's where the conflict arises.
I've been very interested in your views expressed over many years on the importance of the Trinitarian concept. Did this development in your thinking and the stress come as a result of social credit? Has Douglas thrown any light on that for you?
Yes, indeed. Yes, that's derived directly from Douglas. Douglas was a man who didn't talk in a pious way, so to speak. If he, on the rare occasions, fairly regular but infrequent, when he used the language of the Bible, he nearly always threw a new light on it, or of the creeds. Most of us as Christians have been brought up to regard the doctrine of the Trinity as rather mystical. Nowadays, all the trendy clergy are rejecting it. I've heard it described as a theological algebra, and it's supposed to be rather meaningless and incomprehensible. Whereas, Douglas pointed out that if we look around us, we find practical illustrations of the Trinity everywhere. In fact, until the human race began to grasp the Trinitarian nature of reality, we couldn't get far in science or in understanding the environment until we saw matter as three phases, one substance and three phases. We couldn't get much further with it. For instance, when the gas phase was not connected with the liquid phase and the solid phase, there was an awful lot of nonsense that the gas phase was thought to be the spirit and that sort of thing. You couldn't, if you didn't understand the connection between the liquid and solid, you couldn't smelt metals and so on. Also, space, until you could see space as 3 dimensions. But one space, 3 dimensions. See, 1 in 3, 3 in 1, it sounds like nonsense, but it's simple, practical observation, common sense. Time, past, present, future. 3 aspects of time, 3 divisions of time. 1 time, only 1 time. So then I began to think, well, a tripod is the first thing that will stand, which gives stability. 2 or 1 leg, there is no use for stability. This is something inherent right in the universe. And as a scientist, and a lot of people like me who discarded this as, oh wow, this sort of mystical talk and so on, and now see that on the contrary, this is simple to understand, the Trinity, in practical terms. God is incomprehensible, is quite beyond our comprehension, which is why he expressed himself, he became incarnate as a man, and then gave us the Holy Ghost, which completed the Trinity, and the basic conception of balance in politics, in economics, even in what I was talking about, homeostasis, is fundamentally Trinitarian. In our Constitution, unless you've got three balanced powers, at least, you can have more, but you can always resolve them into three.
Well, then would you say that we of the English-speaking world are extremely privileged that our constitutional developments to a very great extent have reflected that Trinitarian?
Yes, this is a development of medieval Christianity, very clearly. Runnymede, which you have thrown some light on and greatly stressed in social credit, and Magna Carta, one of the bases of our freedom, arose out of that trinity: king, barons, church. And later we had crown, lords, commons. And the trouble is that when this becomes unbalanced, you get balance departing from we have somewhat of a reflection of this in the USA and of course in all the former British dominions.
Well, you wouldn't expect in other countries where the religion is the Muslim religion or Hinduism, you wouldn't expect the social constitutional structure then to provide the sort of balance that we have experienced in the past?
No, I wouldn't. Islam worships a monopolistic God, so does Judaism. And if you think the ultimate reality, the ultimate good of the universe is a monopoly, then you will naturally seek a monopoly.
Mm-hmm. If we could just give you a little rest for a moment, we might ask your good lady over there to express her opinions. Now, Dobbs, of course, you have come up through the social credit movement. You work very closely, of course, with your husband. You've produced, I noticed, this little journal here called Home. Perhaps you might care to say something about it. It seems to be your real baby, shall we say, at the moment.
Well, at the moment it's my baby, yes. It started off as the baby of an old lady, now 96, who used it for 30 years or so as a ladies' paper, a woman's paper. But it was a woman's paper that really did things. First of all, it was the first paper to point out the effects of fluoridation. We started the anti-fluoridation movement. I think that's right, isn't it, Geoffrey?
Yes.
Yes, it was.
Housewives Today.
Housewives Today it was then. Its directors also helped to stop rationing in Britain after the war. They all paraded outside the Houses of Parliament, each with a tray containing the rations for a week. You know, 2 ounces of butter, 1/4 pound of margarine, loaf of bread, and so on. Of course, when put on a tray, they looked absurd. And this produced so much publicity. Mind you, this was years after the end of the war. Rationing went on for longer after the war than during the war. And this started the movement to get rid of rationing. After fluoridation, we got rid of a bleaching agent in flour that drove monkeys mad and made dogs hysterical, although I'm not absolutely sure that it's not the other way around. But either way, it didn't seem very desirable to have as a bleaching agent for flour for bread. And it also, from time to time, published a recipe for making your own bread, whole wheat bread, stone ground bread, a simple method for making it yourself. It continued to do so for all its time, so that you didn't have to suffer the white bread that aging was removed from. And we still occasionally publish that recipe because we think that is part of holding, as Geoffrey said, holding the theory of living down to the real practical business of making bread, so to speak. That's all part of it. When Mrs. Palmer got to a certain age, she decided that she was really a bit old to continue with this monthly journal. So she was about 86 or 87. So she asked me if I'd do it. And I took it on with the proviso that we changed its name to Home, because Housewives Today is such a very feminine title. I felt that no men would read it and no men would take it seriously on lines other than the delicious recipes that are published from time to time. So we changed its name to Home, and we also deepened its attack considerably. By this time, in Britain, of course, a great deal of the power over orders and regulations and the things against which you protested, as in fluorides and in aging, it has now passed to Brussels and the common market, which makes protest. The protest is easy enough, but it's not nearly so effective. You can't get at them so much. So it's also necessary to dig deeper into the philosophy below what we were doing, which was always social credit. It always derived from social credit. You'll find articles from my father in the very second issue, I think, and one from you not very long afterwards, Geoffrey, and I wrote also from time to time. So now it is no longer, we found that we could no longer publish a monthly. It is too much work. We haven't a very big staff. In fact, we have practically no staff. So we've made it a 3 monthly, and as I say, with a slightly deeper attack, but still with this attitude of what Geoffrey has explained as the civil service of policy. Only instead of people coming to us and saying, what is the proper way to tackle this, we look round and we see books to be reviewed, actions to be reviewed. It's a review, and on our review we try to indicate that what social credit can add to what the pundits of the day think. Because very often it's required to add just a little something which will alter the whole balance and make a policy valid. So
you've done a lot of writing, of course, in your time.
Yes, yes, quite a lot.
Some of your books?
Well, I wrote a book called Fungi for Fun, which was a book on toadstools for children.
Yes.
It was very popular too, and also among grown-ups as well as children, trying to reduce what in bigger books sounds very complicated to language which children can understand, which is more difficult than it sounds, because you have to make sure that you don't so simplify that the reader has to unlearn what it's learned before it can go on later on.
Mm-hmm. Well, back now to your good husband here. One aspect of his work that I would feel very much remiss if I didn't ask him, and that is in the literary field. And I think it's fair to say that he has been regarded in Britain as some type of minor poet at least. And I'm wondering, Dr. Dobbs, whether you might select one or two of your poems at least for this program tonight and care to read them to. Have you got anything here that you think might be?
Well, I sorted out a few and then I sorted out some more, but perhaps about 3.
Right.
And it might be a little light relief as well, perhaps. Oh dear, I'm afraid this will make a big rustle. A very young poem. I went up to Cambridge after I'd taken a London degree. When I was in the market square, when May was soft and sunny, I saw a thing that made me stare, a large man shapen like a pear, intently counting money. His head was bowed, his stolid glare included every penny, but never wandered anywhere about the sunny market square, in case he should miss any. A little bird was passing by who seemed to think it funny, and stopped to ask, "Please tell me why that man stands like a pig in sty, his snout among that money." I said, "Birds gather twigs for nest, and bees hoard up their honey. But men with bigger brains are blessed, and that is why they think it best to spend life grubbing money."
You got another one or two you'd like to?
Well,
We've got a few minutes.
here's the thing that the first one I think I published in the Social Credit paper of the day. It's called Too Much. Milk is becoming a serious problem not only for farmers but for the community generally. The main trouble is that there is too much of it, so much indeed that the marketing scheme is being drowned in it. Western Morning News, June the 29th, 1935. This sort of went round the world, this poem, first in the Social Credit papers, and then it was copied outside them. But this is just, I'm reading it just to remind you of that Great Depression. The fields are ripe to harvest, the fields are ripe with grain. Oh poverty, oh misery, we have too much again. The silver surplus fishes are rotting in a heap. The fruit is dropping from the trees. There are too many sheep and far too many cattle. There is a glut of meat. Oh poverty, oh misery, we have too much to eat. They've ploughed the cotton under, the wool they leave in stacks, the threadbare clothes of penury still do for people's backs. The great machines are idle, the men are idle too. They have been taught that work is life. They have no work to do. With milk and honey flowing, the promised land has come. The milk is flowing down the drain, but not into the slum. The world of power and plenty envelops us unseen, the plenty of the fruitful earth, the power of the machine. Oh, cruel, bitter mockery, the more that we are blessed with our abundant heritage, the more we're dispossessed. Oh, mean and futile robbery that drives us to despair, that fights against prosperity, lest we should have our share. Oh, needless, mad frustration. Oh, hell and foul damnation, the staring ribs of poverty. The world, I say, the world is well. The shops are full, they live to sell. We cannot live unless we buy with paper tokens. Why, oh why must we be starved? The things are there, the power is there, the skill is there, the need, my God, the need is there. Oh, ledger-bound futility. Oh, screaming imbecility. The money is not there.
I think we've got to have one more.
But yes, I'll leave out. It's a very sad poem called Biography of an Englishman. I think perhaps I'd better read the one that was bad enough to be quoted in Parliament, if I can find it. But I would like to read a very short one afterwards, which is more, this was during the war. London's burning, no reviving, no returning. There it goes in smoke and flame. It will never be the same. It will never be the same. London town where I was born is a picture charred and torn, rich and splendid, dark and mean. It will never more be seen. It will never more be seen. Roaring off to kingdom come, home and office, church and slum, wrapped up in their smoky shrouds, blazing on the bronzed clouds, good and evil, foul and fair, burned to rubble, ash and air. Desolation is such fun, say the leveller and the Hun. Good we build on ill foundations. Peace on earth from blasted nations. Fire and ruin are well done, say the leveller and the Hun. Level, level, quoth the devil, good and evil shall be one. Brave new worlds are built on rubble, fire, burn and cauldron bubble. Soon we shall produce our plan for the betterment of man. Level, level, saith the devil, good and evil shall be one. Union of all mankind dominated by our mind, world policeman, judge and warder, to enforce world law, world order. Level, level, saith the devil, good and evil shall be one. Soon our flag shall be unfurled, soon shall dawn our brave new world. Inequalities smoothed away, neither white nor black but grey. Tepid, neither hot nor cold, middle-aged, not young nor old. Level, level, says the devil, glory, glory, gloats the Hun. And Hosanna, shouts the planner, good and evil shall be one. We who in the ashes dwell want no planned and ordered hell. Fight no wars to be policed when the bombs and fires have ceased. Life's too precious far to give for any freedom but to live. Twixt the leveller and the Hun we are like to be undone. Shackles of their monstrous plan grip the living mind of man. Level, level, saith the devil, struggle with me if you can. We who used to lift our eyes for our succor to the skies find destruction and despair, howling desolation where Hun and devil now hold revel and defile our English air. Lifeless monsters on us fall, shrieking with gigantic sound. We would turn to something small, firmly rooted in the ground. Though all hell the heavens rend, hope shall rise and not descend from the ruin round our feet, gay, invincible, and sweet. Scarcely are the ashes cold, dormant seeds beneath unfold. Twining shoots and leaves are thrust through the rubble and the dust. Green and shouting in the sun, good and evil are not one. Lift your heart up and your head. Living things can cope with dead. We who in the ashes dwell want no planned and ordered hell, fight no wars to be policed when the bombs and fires have ceased. Life's too precious far to give for any freedom but to live. Twixt the leveller and the Hun we are like to be undone. Shackles of their monstrous plan grip the living mind of man. Level, level, saith the devil, struggle with me if you can. We who used to lift our eyes to our for our succor to the skies, find destruction and despair, howling desolation where Hun and devil now hold revel and defile our English air. Lifeless monsters on us fall, shrieking with gigantic sound. We would turn to something small, firmly rooted in the ground. Though all hell the heavens rend, hope shall rise and not descend from the ruin round our feet, gay, invincible, and sweet. Scarcely are the ashes cold, dormant seeds beneath unfold, twining shoots and leaves are thrust through the rubble and the dust, green and shouting in the sun, good and evil are not to run. Lift your heart up and your head. Living things can cope with dead.
Very good.
I'm sorry. I can't compete with your Prime Minister, but sometime.
All right, well, I think Dr. Dobbs and good luck, Elizabeth, but thank you very much for being with us on this program. But we have a few questions from the audience I have here, and perhaps we might just select one or two of those before we complete the program. The one I've looked at, which perhaps would appeal to you the most, and I don't know who's asked this, could you perhaps tell us what social credit is not?
In a nutshell.
Well, that sure is, because it is a question, isn't it? It's practically everything that's, it's not, above all, I should say, it is not a plan or scheme or utopia. Social creditors haven't got an idea how other people should live, and they're not seeking power to impose it on them. There was a phase, say in Alberta, and there have been social credit parties which did seek such power, and it came to nothing. And it's, on the whole, despite all the publicity, and what happened in Alberta did expose what we're up against, but it confused people on the whole, because there are so many. We are not one of those innumerable movements that have a good idea and seek to shove it on everybody. But we do seek to remove the enormous burden of debt finance, which is an enormous moral burden on the whole community, on everybody. And then, if people are freed with that, from that, it's up to them. There certainly wouldn't be a utopia if we could, for instance, introduce a basic income, a national dividend for all, which would be one thing which would remove the enormous burden of debt. If it were done correctly, there'd be no utopia. People used to say, you can't have money for nothing, it corrupt everybody, and then all they do is rush off, get drunk, and some of them would. But that's their choice. But in that sense, in seeking the decentralization of economic and political power, we're not trying to impose something else.
Well, I think that's put as clearly as you can in the short term. We already have touched briefly upon the early work of Douglas. We have one question. Could you tell us something of C.H. Douglas's earlier years?
Not very much, I'm sorry. No, he never expanded much. He was an engineer. He had various respectable engineering jobs in Canada, in South America. He was, I think, general manager for Westinghouse in India at one time. Just before the war, he had an interesting job. Before World War I, this is, 1940. He was concerned with the building of the post office tube in London. Now, this is a tube that carries postal baggage from one part of London to another, to a great sorting house. And it is, I believe, the first working piece of automation in the world. I may be wrong, but now Douglas was not in charge of it, and many people have jeered and said, oh, he had a very minor part in it. He merely had to draw up the electrical specification and see that it was applied, carried out. And I remember some sarcastic young man trying to debunk Douglas, pointed out he wasn't the boss and he didn't organize the whole project. He merely drew up the electrical specification and see that it was carried out in practice too. He supervised the work. So, right from the start, he was in on automation. He knew what was coming. He knew the enormous power that technology could release.
The question to Elizabeth Dobbs.
Can I add to that one?
Yes, fine, yes, you can.
Before he, frivolous,
Yeah.
Before he went in for ideas and social credit, he was very keen on dancing.
Douglas was.
Douglas was, yeah.
Well, yes, I've heard that said that when he arrived in Perth, that some who had travelled on the date was a bit astonished at the great reception he got, and said, is that middle-aged chap that used to spend all his time dancing with his wife? There's nothing wrong with that, I'm sure we'll agree. The question to you is your views on what is generally called the feminine, or the feminist movement in social credit.
Well, there's another big one. As Geoffrey said, what social credit would do would be to remove the financial, would make possible what was physically possible, put it that way. The national dividend would make it possible, for instance, for women either to stay at home or to go to work, or to do what it was physically possible for them to do. The trouble nowadays is that many women have no choice. They have to be feminists and go out to work to earn another wage. Some of them want to do it, but a great many of them don't want to do it. And at home, in our magazine, we consider that the highest profession there is bringing up the men and women of the future, the children. But it's up to people to choose, and they would choose under social credit.
Thank you. And another one here for Dr. Geoffrey Dobbs. Has botany, which is a natural science, helped you to conclude that social credit is natural and reasonable?
I think that any practical application of the mind to the real world, and perhaps that plants are more attractive and more helpful than those things that people can do. So yes, I'd say it certainly has.
And now we move to a slightly technical question. Could consumer price discounts help if there is free trade, enable Australia to import goods she already produces?
I'm sure it would. They would. If consumer discounts, I didn't quite get the bit about imports.
Well, I understand that the question here is that with enabling Australians to import goods she already produces with. That's the name of it. That's the essence of the question.
That's a bit of a stinker.
We have a problem here at the moment with what's called a balance of payment problem, and we're importing hundreds of millions of dollars worth of food into this country, for example, that we could just as easily produce or do produce ourselves. We applied
Is this because you're being undercut by imported stuff?
Yeah.
In general, consumer a discounted price, provided it was correctly applied, would enable people to choose whether to buy the homegrown product or not. And if they buy the homegrown product, if they are unable to buy the homegrown product at a price which will keep the homegrown, the home farmers alive and kicking, so to speak, if it was applied in that way, as to some extent it was in Britain before we were sucked in to the common market, that would keep your home industries going.
Well, time is moving on, and I think there's one question here that perhaps we might finish with. And would you agree that economic and financial reform of any kind depends upon some correction of our political institutions and the system of representative government?
Sorry, can you say it again?
Well, in essence, what I read the question is that economic and financial problems, the first requirement for solving these is that we have political democracy, or we get control of our institutions. However, we're going to get these reforms.
I'm not sure which comes first, the chicken or the egg. Anything to be effective in control of governments has to build up from the bottom. We haven't had time to go on to Douglas's political proposals.
I thought I think the question here is aimed at bringing those out.
He moved on when he, having discovered that the reason why his technical proposals to correct a defective monetary system were not only not applied, but were opposed tooth and nail by the powers that be, he realized that the problem was political. And he went on to make a whole series of experiments in which we took part, starting with a national campaign and then going down to local objectives, in which in Britain before the war were enormously successful. Then the war smashed all that. Then he went on to the Constitution. One light he threw on democracy is that if you're dealing with numbers, democracy is essentially negative. If you can get people who are objecting to something that's imposed upon them to agree, they'll be united. And however much they're brainwashed by the media and the enormous powers that are brought, especially worse now today, television as well, on top of radio and press, schools, everything, you still can't usually brainwash a people who are united in objecting to something. So to that extent, he gave an insight into the control of governments, and insofar as we've applied it on a local scale, it has succeeded. Not always. Depends on the objective chosen. Now here you've got a different situation, which it would be rather foolish, I think, to
In Britain we had
the ghastly way we were sucked into the common market, first of all by a corrupt parliament, because we were sucked in by 8 votes in the second reading of the parliamentary bill. Far more than that number had undertaken to oppose it. They just went back in the world. And then we were told a referendum was impossible, out of the question, unconstitutional. And then when we were given the referendum, after we'd been dragged in, there's an example of inertia selling. We were so flooded with propaganda saying, now we're in, we've got to stay in, we can't possibly come out, we've promised to go in. Officially and unofficially, enormous money spent and so on, after we'd been dragged in. Now, it's rather encouraging when we come here and find that you have the referendum built into your constitution against constitutional changes, and that whenever something that people didn't really want, they have turned it down. So to that extent, and if you can enlarge that base, I hope you can. That base of, I've told Eric before that just as an expression of my opinion, that once it comes round to something positive, the public is more liable to be brainwashed. All the media will represent something which, perhaps when you look into it, people who really understand it find it's just the opposite of what they want, but it will all be represented as the most wonderful thing in the world. And the television in particular is the most appalling power of brainwashing people. So I wouldn't trust the positive, but I would trust the Australian people and the British people, for that matter. If they're given a chance to turn down something, they will do so.
All right. Many nights and many hours, but I'd like to thank Dr. Dobbs, your wife Elizabeth, for appearing with us here this evening, and